Hey there, friends and running fans. This is Amby Burfoot, welcoming you to the latest episode of the podcast, Running State of the Sports.
And this is George Hirsch, your co-host at Running State of the Sport. In every episode, we talk to the smartest, most informed, most influential, and sometimes fastest runners on the planet.
George, this week I'd have to say we talked to someone who combines all of the qualities you just mentioned. He's certainly among the smartest and most influential runners on the planet, and he was factually the fastest in his event for almost 10 years, which is just incredible.
Yeah, of course. Amby naturally is referring to the one and only Edwin Moses. Edwin was a two-time gold medalist in the 400-meter hurdles, even though the U.S. didn't compete in the 1980 Olympics when he was at his prime and sure to win a third gold medal. I doubt anyone will ever match his record of 122 wins in a row in his event. After his retirement from competition in 1988, Edwin continued to have a big impact on the track and field world, primarily through his work with anti-doping organizations and then his long stint as head of the Laureus World Sports Academy. So, Amby, before we get on to Edwin, let's take a quick look at some of the biggest recent running news. What have you looked at?
We do want to keep it quick so we can give full breath to Edwin's interview, which is terrific. I do want to note, and it was a big note, that the world of track and field and road running ended on New Year's Eve with a new world record in the women's 5K on the road. In Barcelona, I believe it was, Beatrice Chebet ran a sensational 13:54. And that's not 14-something, that's not 15-something, that's a 13:54. No woman has previously beaten 14 minutes in any 5,000 anywhere. This would be great news, except for the little niggling question which some people have, and that is that Beatrice Chebet's manager is the same agent who works with Ruth Chepengedich, who ran that 2:09:56 at Chicago. And people are noting that, and it does give some people a little bit of a queasy stomach. I will note on Beatrice's side of the argument that she's been just sensational and unstoppable all year. She won the World Cross Country early in the year. She set a world record in the 10,000 on the track at the Prefontaine meet. She, of course, won both the 5,000 and 10,000 in Paris, as we all saw in the Olympics last year. So there are no blemishes on her record. She turns up everywhere and runs great everywhere. And so I've got to believe she is the top female distance runner in the world this year and last year and going forward. And somewhere there's a world marathon major that's going to open a vein to get her to run their marathon in 2025 and perhaps at a marathon world record, if that's possible, to her sensational achievements of late. And so that's it. That's our view on the recent big news from the world of running. Okay, yeah. Now let's turn to Edwin Moses, today's guest at Running State of the Sport. I don't know how to introduce Edwin except to say he's arguably the greatest track runner of all time. And George, I don't even know there's a good argument on that one. What do you think?
For sure, Amby. We say that because Edwin won the event, the 400-meter hurdles, 122 times in a row. He didn't lose a race for 9 years, 9 months, and some days. That was way back in 1977, the end of that incredible streak. No one else has ever come anything close to it. And frankly, Amby, I think that's one of those records that we talk about that we're not going to see broken.
So George and I have both been fortunate enough to see a new full-length documentary about Edwin that's titled Moses, 13 Steps. Unfortunately, it's not widely available yet, but we'll discuss parts of it today with Edwin and maybe learn when it will become more widely available. Edwin, thank you so much for joining us today. This is a very special pleasure.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here with my dear friends, George and you, Amby, as well, because I've known both of you for years and years. Thank you for having me.
So, Edwin, this is George, and I join Amby in welcoming you and thanking you. We like to begin with the simplest current bio details. How old are you? Where you're living? What occupies most of your day? And just a little bit of an update on what's going on with Edwin Moses.
I live in Atlanta, Georgia, actually a suburb called Brookhaven. It's just north of Buckhead, but it's used to be a part of the city, but it's not. 69 years old for another several months into the year. And everything is doing fine. Still doing a lot of the activities that I have been doing before, working as the chairman of Laureus Foundation USA, also the chairman emeritus of United States Anti-Doping, do quite a bit of consulting, public speaking, and trying to stay in condition and keep my diet right and stay in reasonable shape. But I'm doing fantastic.
Well, it certainly sounds like you're doing fantastic, Edwin, and keeping busy too. As I said, George and I have been lucky enough to see the new documentary about your life. I'm wondering, what was it like for you to relive so many of those years and those big events, and particularly to hear just about everybody else in the movie say, whoa, there's only one Edwin. What was that like?
I think the most poignant part for me was actually seeing some of the races that I had never seen before, because the young people today, they don't realize that there was a time when there was no such thing as recording off of your TV or VHS recording. If you didn't have a VHS recorder and you weren't watching Wild World of Sports when the track meet came on and you didn't push play and record, you'd never see it again. So the Broadview TV, the German company that did the documentary, went through archives all over the world and found races from Spain, the race in Milan, Koblenz, World Cups, World Championships, various races in Europe like Zurich and Berlin and Cologne. And I had never seen those races before, or if I did, I might have seen them in the cafeteria, in the dining room after the race, immediately after the race. As George can remember, they used to show the track meet during the dinners. But other than that, I had never seen those before. So I had tears coming out of my eyes to see those races. I had never seen them before, and they had been long forgotten. And some of them are on YouTube now, but not many. And up until about 10 years ago, they weren't even on YouTube. But there's a lot of them out there. But I saw a lot of races I had never, ever seen before. And also they found some videotape of my mom, who passed away in 2016. So that was another emotional moment, hearing her voice and seeing her in video for the first time. And also the video that my father took back in the 60s, which was embedded in the film when I was a little kid growing up with the dog and playing in the park. So all that was, that was something very special for me and my son too, because he had never seen that video either.
That was fun seeing those old home movies from who knows 60 years ago. It was fabulous.
Yeah. Who has
Edwin,
that?
you've been largely out of the public eye for quite a time now. Your last Olympic Games were in Seoul in 1988, and you did medal there. What do you hope people are going to take away from this documentary? You didn't see a lot of your own races. There's a whole generation of younger people who are going to be seeing Edwin Moses in action for the first time when they see the movie. Tell us a little bit about that, your feeling, and what it was like to have. You had some pretty celebrated friends in the movie: Samuel L. Jackson, Spike Lee, talking about you in extraordinary terms, and you were talking with Tommy Smith, another, of course, Olympic gold medalist and an icon in the civil rights movement from the 1968 Olympics. And tell us a little bit about that and what you hope people are going to take away from this film.
We wanted to make a very serious film, a serious documentary, and that it is. And I wanted the documentary, and so did the film production company, Leopold Hirsch and Michael Vesch, the producer and the director. They felt that they had a very good subject matter. They actually saw me run, a couple of them when they were younger, or knew of me, or saw me on TV because they're in Germany. They wanted to do a serious film that had serious elements that covered a lot of the scenarios and the times in which they witnessed as well. But I was able to make it more poignant and make it relative to what I saw and what happened to me, and the kind of inspirational people and what the conditions were during that time. And people like Spike Lee and Sam Jackson and Neil deGrasse Tyson, and especially my brother, really weighed in on that, quite eloquently. And so it's like a historical time capsule. It's a true documentary, and I wanted it to show many, many elements of my life that people didn't know. A lot of people, as you both know, they knew that I did something in science, but they never knew that I actually worked as an engineer, and got to see footage from General Dynamics, got to see how myself and my colleague Steve Price and Leroy Penix and other members of the track team, how at 18 and 19 years old, we were developing ideas and models that would have been right at the state of the art of biomechanics and sports science, of which there was none during that time. So we were serious physics students, and I didn't even have the talent when I first started running track, but we just loved the sport of track and field, and tried to do as much as we can using science as the background. Also, it talks about my colleague Ken Yoshino, the physical therapist out in California. We were doing some very innovative things in the early 80s out there, using ice and PNF stretching and dynamic training and plyometrics and muscle testing, body fat testing, all these different things in conjunction with my training. As you remember, when I was getting in ice back in the 80s, everyone thought I was stoned out of my mind. People were afraid of it. They didn't think it had any benefits, but I was getting those benefits, for the last half of my career. And that's pretty much why I never got injured. I never had any injury. I had a back injury and a knee injury, but I never had any long muscle injuries or something that kept me out of training. And then the family structure that I grew up in Ohio, growing up in an academic family, it's a story that needs to be told. And we all thought that there was a gap in the type of documentaries that really kind of talked about that time, what happened in the late 60s and 70s, and also the Tommy Smith episode, how important he was in the world, and especially in the African American community when I'm 12, 13 years old and really just beginning to run track. And what kind of impact and what was happening in the country during that time. And so it's like a time capsule of my life. And many of my close friends, they knew a lot about me, but when they saw the film, they say, I knew a lot about you, but I didn't know like all of these things put together. So I wanted to have it all in one place. And it was a 3.5 year labor of love and intensity as well, to find all the relevant information, catalog videotapes, let them know where information was, and let them find the people to be able to tell the story without me having to tell it, like Mike Shine did in the 1976 Olympics. It took me like 4 months to track Mike down. I mean, I tried everything. I was on the phone, email. I finally found him by going through one of these personal information detective services online, and there were like 8 or 9 numbers, and I called everyone, and Mike picked up the phone one day. Bringing in people like my colleague Spike Lee and Tommy Smith, who lives here in town, and Neil deGrasse Tyson, who I met on his podcast about 3 years ago, and Sam Jackson, who he was on campus when I was there. He was a few years ahead, but finding out that catching him at a play in New York, the piano lesson, and talking to him about it and convincing him to do it, and everyone said yes. Everyone said yes. Having Danny Harris tell the story about Madrid, because I was sick as a dog. Having Andre Phillips tell the story about Koblenz. So that made the film what it is, to have other people tell the story that I should not have had to tell, I think, because my version, I believe, would have been quite boring versus theirs. So all of these people really made the film what it is. 3.5, 4 years, and it was a long journey, starting just with information, waiting to see what a film would look like. And I had nothing to do with the editorial. That I didn't know what the story was going to be. I never listened to or attended any of the interviews from the 45 people that they interviewed, around 70 hours. The film is 1 hour and 45, so you can only imagine how much is still there to do a sequel, to do another type of film, or a more intense, specific film.
You know, Edwin, speaking from a journalistic background, I think you're completely right in your analysis of the film, because while it is fascinating to hear everything you're telling us now, and if the whole film had just been a camera on you, that would have been pretty interesting, I think. But all of the interview guests that they had and the way they segmented into the film really made it. When I got the opportunity to watch the movie, I was like, yeah, I guess I got an hour of my life for Edwin Moses. But the film was just so much better than I could possibly have imagined. It's really magnificent. And that brings us to the only question everyone listening wants to know, which is, when is this thing going to be available for wider streaming? Do you have any information on that?
None right now. We're in the process and have been in the process for months. It is actually showing in theaters. It was made as a full-length theatrical documentary. Starting December 5th, it started showing in Germany on multiple screens all over, and a lot of people have seen it. That was the first contractual obligation, because it was made and produced in Germany. It had to be shown in Germany. We've had several showings here in the United States. We went to the LeBron James Film Festival back in June or July as a private showing. We had about 300 people there, filled the room. And then we showed it at Morehouse College, which was the U.S. premiere. And, most theaters have between 175 and 300, 350 on the big side. We had 1,700 people at Morehouse watching the first time it had really been shown publicly. We have been on the film festival circuit, and the film's been very highly acclaimed. We have been in 8 film festivals, and we won awards in 5, including the San Diego International Film Festival back in September. We got an award at the Morehouse Film Festival for documentary. We received an award in Paris at the IOC, World Olympians Association Film Festival, where we won the best feature documentary. We won in the Czech Republic, Liberec Sport Film Festival. We won the grand prize there. And about, 2 weeks ago now, we won at the Palermo in Sicily Film Festival. We won an award there. And we also were invited to the New York Documentary Film Festival. We didn't win an award. There was some fantastic films there, and that's probably the #1 doc film festival. But we were asked to show the film. Specifically, of all the 200 films that they had, they asked us to show the film because it was relevant to students who were studying film, drama, dance. They had track and field athletes there, and also athletes who were studying STEM, science, physics, math. So we had about 100 kids there, 75 kids there. Neil deGrasse Tyson showed up for that show, and that was the first time I'd actually physically met him. And so we thought that was that we know that the film is relevant to many, many different audiences, which is the way it was designed. We wanted to have a film that kids could understand, people who love track and field would understand, people that just like sports in general can see the genesis and how you don't have to be the best at the beginning to become a winner. I think George knows the story. When I left high school, my freshman year in high school, I was 5'6", 102 pounds. My junior year, and I've got the actual rosters from the football team, I was 5'7", $117 in high school. And I didn't get too much bigger than that by the time I went to college. But I was unrecruitable in track and field, leaving high school for junior college level or whatever, completely unrecruitable. Just loved track and field, the incremental improvement part of it, and went to a school with no track and no field and no real program. And 3 years later became Olympic champion. So we wanted to tell that story. And with that story, it becomes all the different elements of things that I had seen and witnessed and experienced that inspired me to stay in the sport of track and field when everyone was better than me. And I tell the story, I always lost until I won, always. And I was always a little kid, as my coach tells the story that, he said, look at the watch. I was the smallest kid on the team. It's always started out at the back of the pack on the first one or two runs. And then later on in the workout, I'd be working my way up. And so I fought my way to the front of the pack, over 6 or 7 years until I, became a champion. So that's a part of the story we think is very inspirational and that we wanted to capture the story.
It certainly is. And Edwin, before you came on, I told George I was going to get interrupted. I'm having a treadmill delivered to the house more or less right now. I'm getting texts from the Amazon guys. So I'm going to have to just sort of go silent for a while. George, you continue on with a few questions, and then I'll come back, and hopefully I'll have a treadmill.
Great. So, Edwin, it's interesting to contrast your documentary with what we've been seeing lately on Netflix, and that's the series called Sprint. Today's top sprinters, or at least some of them, seem really consumed by their off-track style, flamboyance, if you will, as much as, even by their on-track performances. You, on the other hand, were the opposite. You were all business on the track. You seemed quite private in your own life, and I just wonder if you'd like to sort of comment on that.
Well, I in my film, I wanted to show not just what happened out on the track. You've seen the film. I don't even think we really started talking about competitions until about a third of the way through the film, where you started seeing pictures of me running and the explanations of what was happening from Mike Shine and then from Andre Phillips and then from Danny Harris and talking about the winning streak. But in addition to that, there's heavy emphasis on what I did off of the track, what kind of activities that I had working with and the genesis of drug testing. Starting with 1989 and Ben Johnson, how all of that occurred, why we actually have drug testing today. Also, more importantly, why athletes are even able to make money today. Because when I was running, I got close to being banned about 3 or 4 times, and publicly, excoriated in the newspapers in England, being at a track meet where money was being given out, and Pepco and I and Tessa Sanderson and a bunch of English athletes were ready to get banned. But I was relentless in figuring out that this sport needed to change, that for the athletes to be making no money was ridiculous. And I was a mouthpiece for that. But today, athletes have a platform. They what they used to say, George and Amby. One of the worst things you can do is believe your own publicity. And so for me, it was all about winning because I came up the hard way in track and field. I didn't have coaches. I basically had to teach myself how to run hurdles. Had to teach myself a training protocol. Had to go out with the stopwatch on my wrist and train all the time. Didn't have any assistance except for Ken Yoshino, the physical therapist, after the fact. So I came up in a very, very different way. I wanted to show that in the film. But one thing I noticed that, over there's been world championships, I guess, every year for the last 3 years, and a couple of Olympic games as well. One of the things I noticed is that every athlete has their brand. They're doing lots of activities off track. You can see when they go eat. You can see when they travel. You can see what events that they go to. And one of the things I noticed that during Paris, the athletes who were the most active, in many cases, are not the ones who won medals. In many cases, they didn't even make the team. So I think it's a big distraction. And I've talked to a couple of athletes who are more interested in, and they've admitted to me, I'm really building my brand. Whether I win or not, I don't really, that's to be determined, but I'm going to make a brand out of this. But, that separates, those of us who are able to go to 2, 3, 4 Olympic Games and win medals all the time versus the people who are lucky enough to get in there once, if at all.
I'm back, guys, and I think my treadmill is getting delivered, which is why the dog is barking so much. So apologies for that. I'm interested in the technical part of the 400 hurdles, which I don't frankly understand and haven't followed. I know how marathoners think about an event. We break it down into the first 10K. You got to go easy, and then you just hold pace, and you hope you don't bonk when you hit the 20-mile mark. But how does a 400-meter hurdler break the race down into sections, and what's the most important thing in that event?
Well, you know that there's 10 hurdles in the events, and there's 31 mistakes you can make. that are you start with 34 possibilities for errors. The first one is the start, and for each of the 10 hurdles, it's the takeoff, the flight over the hurdle, and the landing. So you start off with, possibly 31 strikes against you. And what's going to determine what kind of time you have is how few mistakes that you make. I used to talk a lot of time about making mistakes that people never see, but I know and I can feel, and things that you can change if you know what you're doing, if you know your body, and you know the dynamics and the mechanics of running. So you start out with 31 mistakes, possibly. I learned in my first big track meet at the Montreal Olympic Games, out doing start practice with the Swiss. He was from Switzerland. His name was Max. I forget his last name, but he was the main starter in Montreal. And I guess about a week before the games, I was out doing starts with the electronic blocks, which I had never used before at that level. And they had the reaction time. And my reaction time was like 0.13, 0.12, on the high side of 0.16. So I figured that my start was just as good as any other sprinters, because he told me, he said, you're coming out of the blocks and getting that impulse just as quick as the guys who are running 100 meters. And that was a part of my race plan because I had changed my start for the 400 hurdles. I used to take 21 steps, and then I changed 20 and flip my legs in the blocks. And then I moved to 19 and flip back to the power side as I matured during that year. And so my whole strategy was get out of the blocks, being that I had to run 19 steps, which was very, very difficult. I don't think too many people were doing it up until recently, maybe Kevin Young and a few people after that. But I had to come hard out of the blocks. And because I was a good high hurdler, going over 36-inch hurdles was not too much of a problem for me. So I had very, very good technique. And so I just maximized, my start, getting to the first hurdle, being a very good hurdler. And then by the time I got past the second hurdle, I'm going at full speed already between the first and the second hurdle. I'm always at full speed. So I kind of like pulled back the gas, went into cruise, waited about the seventh and eighth hurdle, and then started running hard again. So that was basically it. But I was in condition because I ran a lot of cross country. I did everything from 1,000 meters to 600s to 800 meters in the grass repeats. So I was in excellent aerobic condition, and and anaerobic condition as well. So with the 13 steps, it was easy for me to maintain my stride length and finish out strongly.
Some story. And the movie is called Moses 13 Steps. And tell us, just exactly how did you end up figuring out that you were at that point the only one using the 13-step approach?
I ran one meet in 1975. I think I ran a 52.3. I think that's what I have recorded. And I really didn't know what I was doing. I just got thrown in to get some points at a dual meet, at a conference meet. I ran 52.3. Didn't really think that much of it. But I was running 13 steps, and I always used my left leg because that was the leg I would use for high hurdles. So I think it was natural because I was in condition. I didn't use 13 steps at the end of the race until the Florida relays in 1976. And everyone was amazed. In fact, there were some coaches down there saying it was impossible and you couldn't have done it. But I knew I had done it. Because you don't even have to sit there and count steps. If you use the same leg, you're taking an odd number of steps. And so being that I did that, I knew I was taking 13 steps. And that was normal and natural for me because I was in top condition. The way my basic running style, I generated a lot of power, stayed in the air for a long time, which was conducive for taking off. If you take off at the right point, doing a perfect trajectory over a 36-inch hurdle and be able to come down and continue running without jumping vertically and coming down and starting and stopping all the time. So that was really my big advantage.
Edwin, once at the end of a cross-country NCAA championship that he won, I heard Jerry Lindgren tell the assembled press, all three of them, that the reason he was better than all the rest of us was because he was a left-footed runner. And so now there are two of you who are left-footed runners and better than everybody else. It may be a new thing for people to try to figure out. But moving on, you've been involved in parts of the sport that, frankly, I wasn't very aware of. And a big one of those was the anti-doping movement, which barely existed or didn't exist early in your career and came on later. Apparently, you were one of the first to figure out that out-of-competition testing was absolutely essential. Can you tell us what your role was in that?
Well, I think the first time that I ever visited the laboratory was in 1983. After the 1980 boycott, a lot of things changed. The rules changed for us to become professionals. I met Dr. Donald Catlin, who was the lab director at UCLA, and became very close to him. He knew that I was very much anti-doping. And what put me in on that track was the fact that I didn't have anything. I mean, I barely had a pair of shoes up until the 1976 Olympics. So I was the type of athlete who said, it has to be done on natural talent because that's literally all I had. Natural talent, no training facilities, no shoes, just love of the sport. So at the 76 Olympics, which was probably about my 14th or 15th race overall, and I won, I saw how the American women specifically were decimated by the East Germans and the East Germans and the Bulgarians and the Czechs and the Poles and the Russians. And it was just no contest. And they were sending women out there that were doped to the gills, and everyone knew it. And so I saw the heartbreak, from athletes who probably could have won, but who would just beat to the punch in every single event. I think the East Bloc women won almost everything, from 100 meters all the way up to marathon. And then it started getting worse. At the World Cup in 77, it was the same. In 79, it was the same. We had a couple of athletes who did well. Evelyn Ashford was one of them, for example, in the 100 meters. But I used to talk to these athletes all the time, and they were just heartbroken. We didn't go to the 1980 Olympics, but I think it might have been a blessing because we probably would have just got blown away in Russia during the Cold War with all the East Bloc athletes doping. I don't think we would have had a chance. Because if you recall, in 1976, I was the only individual gold medal winner in an individual event. Other than that was Arnie Robinson, Mac Wilkins, and Bruce Jenner. We were the only 4 gold medals outside of relays and track and field. And I think Frank won the silver in the marathon.
That's
But other
right.
than that, we were decimated. I was the only Olympic gold medalist from 1976 to 84. And talking to Dr. Catlin, he always knew that from a scientific point of view, you can always get away with titration of the substance you were taking, and that the lab could not detect everything all the time. And the only way to really make it fair was out of competition testing. So it wasn't until 1989 until that kicked in, but we started talking about that in 1980, 1981. So it was a long road, and the athletes were torn over it too. There was a school of athletes within the federation that said, well, if the Russians are doing it and the East Germans are doing it, we should do it too, so at least we can be competitive. And I just disagree with that whole philosophy, because I just figured that if it was my daughter or my niece or my cousin, male or female, I just don't think that they should be in a situation where they have to dope just to be competitive, or feel that everyone else is doing it, therefore I have to do it too, which was what the argument that Lance Armstrong had. I just thought that was totally wrong and corrupt. And in addition to that, the authorities, the people who are running the sport, were absolutely looking the other way. And I just thought it was just corrupt from top to bottom, not just the athletes, the coaches, but also the people that were administering the sport. And so I put my neck out on the line to go for a sport in which you didn't have to do that. And out of competition testing was a part of that. And 1988, when Ben Johnson tested positive, that was a catalyst that allowed us at TAC at the time to start the out of competition testing program from scratch. We had to legislate, get the votes, convince the athletes that it was the best thing for the sport, convince the people who were running the committees, and then we had to have a vote. And we forced the vote to be a hands in the air vote versus one of these votes where everyone just mumbles yes or no. So we forced everybody to stand up and vote for it publicly so that they can be seen. And we won the vote and started with a clean slate to start developing the out of competition testing program. But it was athletes that demanded it. It didn't come from the top. It came from athletes. We pushed it up and got it going. And that was the genesis of out of competition testing. Today, computer power is on the side of the anti-doping authorities, because back then, in the late 80s and 90s, the analogy was you can take a gallon of a steroid, for example, or stimulant, and put it in an Olympic-sized swimming pool, and they can detect it. Now it's one drop. So the computer power is so much more powerful that allows them to detect a small amount of a lot of drugs, and also to be able to sample for drugs that are experimental drugs today, like the selected androgen release modulators and genetic manipulators and other types of heart medications and whatnot. So, yeah, it was a long journey, but it was the athletes that wanted the sport to be cleaner than it was, and not be dominated by athletes who were not clean, and everyone knew it.
So, Edwin, if I can follow up there, 100% of us agree with everything you've just said and the necessity of it. And yet here we are many years later, and we don't appear to have a clean sport yet. We have institutional doping from Russians, and I don't know who else. In the marathon world, there have been an increasing number of Kenyan dopers in the last couple of years, and I frankly used to think they were the cleanest athletes on earth. I mean, they're a third world. How could they possibly be involved in doping? And yet now we know that's going on. So what's your perspective on where we stand today, and is it going to get better?
Well, there's always going to be people who drive under the influence of alcohol, people that use opioids, people that, do all kinds of things, people that cheat on tests, people that will steal. There's always going to be someone out there that does that. And I understand the financial incentive of, say, an athlete from an African country. You win a couple of marathons and 10Ks during the course of a year and make $150,000. You can take care of you and 50 other people for the rest of their lives. So that incentive has a lot to do with it. Still doesn't make it right for the sport. So, we have, from what we know in our research at USADA, we know that there's a hardcore 8 to 10 to 15% of people who may dope no matter what, and who are going to have a system, who are going to have a doctor, who are going to have a supplier, who are going to have a coach or trainer who's facilitating things. We know that that's going to occur, but we just have to make it as difficult as possible. We're never gonna completely eradicate it just because of the incentive. And people want to win. And so if you live in a world where you can actually be a mediocre athlete with no chance of winning, connect with the right people, take the right substances, have good coaches, which is always a requirement. No one's just taking pills and becoming better. Have a good training system, good coaches, and become better in a year or a year and a half or two. Go from the back of the pack to the podium. It's a heck of an incentive. So we know that there's always going to be that exists. So they're doing the best that they can, but and one of the big benefits, the big tools right now is the ability to go back and look at samples 10 years. For 10 years, that's really huge. I think even in that 2024, they were still adjudicating tests from the London Olympics, which turned out to be a very dirty Olympics. We've had a handful of American athletes. I think there's at least 3 that have gotten upgraded medals just in the sport of track and field. So, that's a really big tool. Yeah. But I just don't think that if I had a daughter or a granddaughter, I would not like to have them participate in a sport where the specter is that more people are using doping. Therefore, if you don't use, you can't compete. I just think that that's wrong.
Edwin, you're still the chairman emeritus of USADA, and you've got so many things on your plate. I want to switch to the Laureus World Sports Academy, which I bet some of our listeners don't know much about. And this is something you've devoted a lot of time and energy to as the chairman for many years. And why don't you explain a little bit about Laureus to us and tell us about the job you've done with them?
Yeah, the Laureus, it's pronounced like the word glorious. It's Laureus, which is the original Greek word for the laurel wreath that they used to give to Olympians back in the day. Even in the 1936 Olympics, you'll see a picture of Jesse Owens with the laurel wreath around his head. So it's the original word. It was started in the year 2000 by a guy named Johann Rupert, who is the CEO of Richemont, the Richemont companies, which is high luxury brands, Cartier, Mont Blanc, Alfred Dunhill, IWC watches, super high brands. They're the ones that advertise on page 2 and page 3 of the New York Times. And he, in conjunction with a gentleman who is the CEO of Mercedes-Benz South Africa, they were both very close and lived in South Africa. The companies were based in South Africa. They were very close with Nelson Mandela. And when when Nelson Mandela came out of jail and became president, he asked Johann Rupert to ask to become a consultant in terms of equalizing the whole labor movement, the whole the way jobs were given out, the rules to get rid of all the segregation within the country, and which he did. And so in 1994, there's a film about it called Evictus, where the rugby World Championship was played in South Africa between New Zealand and the South African rugby team, and there was no blacks on the team. The population was really upset about it. The country was ready to go into chaos and civil war. And so Nelson Mandela walked out in his green South African Springbok uniform, and they made contingencies to have, I think, 2 or 3 blacks on the rugby team. And he kind of brought the tone down of potential civil war getting ready to happen in the country. And so these 3 men, Nelson Mandela, Johann Rupert, and I forget his name, Mr. Who was the head of the German, Shrimp, Mr. Shrimp. They decided that they wanted to start an organization to use sports as a tool for social change. Mandela, having been in prison for 27 years in South Africa, the only section he was allowed to read was the sports section. And so they talked about it for years. That was 1994. It wasn't until the year 2000 that they decided that Johann Rupert put together this organization that would raise money, give money to kids all over the world, and use sport as a tool for social change. So I was elected the first chairman in the year 2000. We had 2 donations from Mercedes-Benz and Richemont of 500,000 euro apiece. And I was the first chairman. We had no infrastructure, no programs. We just knew that we wanted to do something good. So I was on the ground helping them build this organization to an organization that under my tenure, we raised about 150 million euro. We started out with 6 projects in 4 different countries. I think the first year we affected maybe 5,000 kids to an organization that's raised 150, affected 2 to 3 million kids. And we've had about 200 projects all around the world and 9 foundations. We have 9 independent foundations. So we've done a lot to use a social rationale to recruit kids, get them involved in sports, and at the same time impart knowledge on them. It may be making sure that they go to school, making sure that they get meals, making sure that they don't live on the street, dealing with all kinds of social issues. So I've been doing that for quite a while.
Edwin, for those who know you even a little, I think it's not a surprise that your work has extended far beyond track and field and 400-meter hurdles into so many important social spheres, especially globally, Africa and beyond. You've been with us about 45 minutes now, which is as long as we ask most people to give us time. But we got a couple more killer questions we'd love to ask you if you could stick with us for a few more.
Go ahead.
Good. Okay. As you know, there are some new forces brewing in professional track and field, and a big one seems to be Michael Johnson's got some money to put together something called Grand Slam Track, which is attracted some serious competitors because of the incentives they have. Do you have any thoughts or knowledge or feelings about how Grand Slam Track is going to affect athletics?
I think it's really good for the sport because there need to be several different ways to approach the sport. I've always believed and still believe today that track and field should be a strictly professional sport, that athletes ought to be compensated. I mean, I started working on that, 40 plus years ago, 45 years ago, and that's successful today. But when I was running, as an example, to show you how these other sports have prospered and thrived, in 1978, to win the Wimbledon or the U.S. Open, the prize was $60,000 or $80,000. Those sports unionized, track and field didn't. I was trying to seriously make an effort. I still have all the documents downtown to have the track athletes to unionize so that we could assist and we could commercialize the sport, get money flowing in through television revenues, share the revenues with the athletes, be able to pay athletes more money to participate. So I think it's great to have another league. And also the fantastic meet that they had, the women's meet in New York with the husband of Serena Williams, was really great. And then you have Paul Doyle and his track circuit that runs about 6 or 7 meets during the year of which the Edwin Moses Classic was a part of it last year at Morehouse. So I think it's really great. But the fact is that no one's made a successful attempt to unionize the athletes. And if the athletes became much more organized and had a union that represented them in TV contracts, negotiations, sponsorship, track and field could be the sport that it ought to be. And I've been around for 48 years now, since 76, and I see it clearly. And my attempt in 1981 did not work because I didn't get the support of the athletes. And so the problem is that when they're on the top, they don't really think about what's going to happen to the sport once they leave. So it's really like, and that's what happened to me. I had a press conference set up one day, and everyone said they were going to come, but the only one that showed up was Bob Kersey, and no one else showed up. And I had like 30 members of all the mainstream media that used to cover track and field back then. So that's the problem with track and field. I personally think that it should be a standalone sport and not have to support all the other aspects of running here in the United States. And I feel the same way about distance running, and that's pretty much that way now. It's its own circuit, and it doesn't really depend on what happens within the federation. The people who organize Chicago and San Diego and Atlanta and Boston and New York, they all operate independently, and that segment of the sport is growing.
Edwin, the head of World Athletics, Sebastian Coe, has thrown his hat into the ring as the possible next head of the IOC. That election's coming up early in this new year, and I'd love to get your thoughts on that one.
All I know is what I read in the newspaper. I've read all the manifestos. They're pretty much the same. I think Seb has tried to make some changes in the sport of track and field that would indicate where other international federations could go in other sports in terms of paying the athletes. There's a lot of pushback. There's a little bit of pushback on that publicly, but I can only imagine that behind the scenes, a lot of these international federations, they don't want that at all. They still want to remain relative. And especially with the way sports is branded today, the athletes are determining the dynamics of the sport and how popular it is and how much television coverage is going to get, because these TV channels and networks, they're looking at the profiles of the athletes. They want, Schifrin, for example, in skiing, she probably has a couple million followers, and they're looking at that to determine where the money flows and where the sponsorship flows. So I'm sure there's a lot of pushback from a lot of smaller countries that don't have huge Olympians winning medals or big Olympic committees. I think a lot of those people will want to remain relative, and they don't have any big time athletes, or they are able to continue to manipulate and control them. So they're not going to necessarily agree with what Seb is proposing. That's my personal feeling. I don't know. I used to be, we have like 6 or 7 members of Laureus who are IOC members, and I used to talk to them regularly. But I haven't had any discussions with them. But I was the first IOC Athletes Commission member, with Thomas Bach and with Seb Coe and with Kip Keano and with Peo Schmidt and with before even Guy Drew came involved and before Nawal came involved. So I know what the thinking is like inside of the organization. And I think it's much more conservative now than it was then. And you never hear anything from the IOC members as you did when I was an Athletes Commission member. They don't speak freely anymore. That's been shut down. And so it's a different type of organization. Yeah. Not necessarily a democratic organization.
Edwin, I don't want to say I'm happy to hear you say that, but I'm a little bit relieved because it stuns me how little we know about what is going on at IOC and this forthcoming election, which maybe is important. I'm not sure, but the right person at the top of the IOC could certainly do some very, very good things. Let's go to another political domain, and that is that we just lost a president who lived in your state. And he was also, of course, the force behind the 1980 Olympic boycott, which cost you an almost certain gold medal, I would think, and more time in the spotlight and more possibilities for personal growth and financial growth. And yet he did a lot of great things we all recognize outside. So do you have any particular thoughts on Jimmy Carter? Did you meet him? You must have met him.
I met him at the White House. I had been trying to get a meeting with him probably like 4 or 5 years before COVID, but it was difficult to do. He was so busy and he didn't take a lot of visitors. But I liked him as a president. I mean, he had a presidency that was, chaotic during that time, but there was a lot going on in the world. But a lot of people don't know that he was an officer on a nuclear submarine, the first ballistic submarine. He was very in tune. He was a policy geek, I think they called him. He knew a lot about a lot of different things. And of course, I was disappointed with the boycott, like all my colleagues that did not get a chance to go, that should have gone, were. But I think what he did, not sending us to the Olympics, I do think we would have gotten a beat down in Moscow just because of what I saw when we went there for the Goodwill Games. The swimming pool had moss in it. Kermit the Frog was hanging out on the pool deck. The pool was green. They were using, white sound to disrupt people's sleep. The U.S. team had poor accommodations. The food was horrible. I think we would have gone to the Olympics in 1980 and just been exposed. And it was Cold War during that time. It was spy versus spy. And I think we would have just gotten rummaged during that time. I think I would have won my event, but I don't think that would have been across the board. But a lot of my personal friends are still in a state of PTSD that didn't get a chance to go to the Olympics during that time. But he's very well missed down here. I think he's done a lot, Jimmy Carter, in his life, more than almost any other president after his presidency. To monitor elections, to get rid of diseases, to feed people, to building houses all over the state of Georgia. So he's done a tremendous amount. And we miss him down here in Atlanta.
Edwin, one personal question before we get to our two final closing questions. You suffered some serious head injuries some years ago. I think it was in 2017, and they really affected you seriously. Tell us about it. How did you overcome those injuries, and did your athletic history and heritage help you get through that battle?
I just had a subdural hematoma. I fell down the steps and had 2 concussions back to back, 6 weeks apart. So I'm taking laundry down the steps and just missed a step. My robe got caught between my legs, so I did an Eddie the Eagle down 13 steps, face first, and head into the wall. Didn't break anything, but I was definitely knocked out and woke up face bleeding. About 6 weeks later, I'm getting into my car to go do a lecture and attempted to toss something over to the passenger side, step in the car and get in at the same time. And I smashed my head directly into the top of the door jamb really, really hard. And within 12 hours, I started suffering from neurological deficit. I couldn't, my leg, my foot, when you walk up the steps, you don't even think about walking up the steps. And all of a sudden, 10 or 12 hours later, your foot is banging into the steps. Your gait is shorter than it was. This went on for about 10 days. At about 10 days. And I had a friend who was a neurologist who came and saw me every other day to let me know that I wasn't having a stroke or an aneurysm. But the likelihood was that I was having a brain bleed, which I was, subdural hematoma. 10 days later, it got to the point where I couldn't even stand up and get up. Went to get a CAT scan. Thought I was going to go home. It was the middle of summer. I had on slippers and shorts, had my wallet, keys, and glasses. And I had to take an Uber because I couldn't drive anymore. It was like I had never driven a car in my life. It affected me so much. So 10 days later, after the MRI, they took me right to the hospital. And I stayed there for 10 days. I was literally, well, not literally, actually paralyzed from the waist down. So my sensory system and nervous system had completely disconnected. So my legs and feet, knees, they didn't know what they were supposed to do. And that was 2017. It took me 3 years to really get back on my feet, like in a stable way. I always had to be ready to fall, or if I tripped or went on a surface, it was even 2 or 3 degrees tilted to the side, or hit a cobblestone, or going off of curbs. For 3 years, I had to be very, very careful. But it took a total of 6 years to recover, for my brain to really come back to normal. Memory, executive thinking, ordering, speech, vocabulary. It took 6 years to really come back. And I think it had to do with the rehab program that I did. I didn't go to the hospital and go on the type of rehab that they would have prescribed to me, because I knew it would be useless. So a friend of mine, Renee, her last name is Bazazzi now, but it used to be Renee Felton, who was a 100-meter hurdler in 1980, came to the rescue. She had treated my son for a knee injury. She lives in Italy, and stayed with me for like 3 months. And we did for what I was able to do, being not able to walk and put one foot in front of the other and on a walker, it was really an Olympic class approach with swimming, exercises, exercise to recalibrate the brain and reorganize the brain. Running, I couldn't even run a quarter of a mile when I first started. It felt like a marathon, the exhaustion. So a diet, electrostimulation, all kinds of things. So I did that for 3 solid months straight and got back on my feet relatively quickly. But it took another 3 years to be steady on my feet, and another 2-3 years after that for my brain to really kind of calm down, get back to where it was, and to be able to think, talk, speak, write, type, and do all those things normally. So I was very lucky that I was in shape, didn't have any underlying conditions, and took the right approach, which was very, very aggressive. It was no joke. It was very aggressive. And I think coming out of this, I think that most people who have these brain injuries or lots of different types of injuries, I think there needs to be a very physically aggressive rehabilitation program to get you back to normal and force the body to, in my case, rewire my brain and my body.
Well, it's certainly clear that the program was highly successful in your case, Edwin, and you took the Olympian approach, unsurprisingly, and we're so glad it worked out as it has. I'm going to ask you just one additional question now, our final question, since you've already given us an hour of your time. So this podcast is called Running State of the Sport. So naturally, we ask all our guests, what's your assessment of the state of running, athletics, track and field, whatever you want to call it? What's going really well, and what do you think could be improved at this point?
Well, I think there's going to be a transition after having Olympics, World Championships, Olympics, World Championships, World Championships, back to back to back. I think there's going to be a natural adjustment. I think that the possibilities that athletes have to run meets is very, very intense. It's not like they don't run 20, 25 meets a year anymore. Some of the top athletes run 8 or 10 times of that. And it's all very intense from the very beginning. So I think that's where a lot of athletes are burning out, why some of our top athletes didn't make the team, collapse in the trials. I think there's going to be a lot shorter lifespan of athletes going forward, because I don't think you can train at that intensity, compete at that intensity, even if it's fewer times a year, and have a longer career. But I think there's hope. I'm anxious to see what Michael's circuit is going to do. One of the disappointments that I've heard from athletes is that in many track meets today, there's no women's long jump, there's no triple jump, there's no javelin throw. There's a lot of events that athletes can't compete in. Or if it's the big meets, if you go to the New York games, or the big event in California, some of these larger events, the field is limited to 8 or 10 people. So it's not like it used to be, George, where there's 15 people doing a long jump and 20 high jumpers, and they have two different flights of high jump. It's not like that anymore. So a lot of athletes, from what I hear, are having problems finding competitions, finding world-class competition. So that's going to have to be solved. How, I really don't know. Yeah, because I don't keep up with it on a day-to-day basis, nor am I a member of the federation because of my fiduciary responsibility to USADA and having to stay separated from anything having to do with any of the sports. So I'm just a innocent bystander, observer. And most of what I hear is either reading in the news and analyzing it, or hearing from people that may know a little bit more.
Well, if you're just a bystander or observer, Edwin, you're certainly one of the most acute and observant out there, and one of the most important, with a lot of years and a lot of perspective to add to the discussion. So that's it for our podcast today with Edwin Moses, who we're simply going to call the greatest track runner of all time at this point. Edwin, it was such a pleasure to speak with you today. And George, you've been a fan of Edwin's for so long, I thought you might like to say a few words too.
Well, nothing more than just a big thank you, Edwin. As you know, I loved coming to the screening of the movie, and I hope as many people see it as possible, because it's the story of just an incredible athlete, but even a more incredible human being. Thanks so much, Edwin.
All right. Thank you. Thank you.
Amby, it might be a long time before we have another guest who's contributed as much to our sport as Edwin Moses. What a towering figure he's been. And what struck you most about his comments?
Well, I'd like to say everything, George, but I suppose that I'm not allowed to do that. I think that there's no one who has done as much in our sport, including his incredible competitive career, and also outside of sport, in the culture and ethics of what is so important to us. I would say that Seb Coe is maybe in the same ballpark, and Frank Shorter perhaps a notch below, but Edwin has been so important in so many areas of the sport. In the interview, I really appreciated that he understood that the movie had to have other characters in it besides himself. I mean, he could have told his own story and it would have been pretty exciting. But if you add Spike Lee, Samuel L. Jackson, Karsten Warholm, and so many others who were there also, it adds so much to the depth and breadth of this movie. And I'm so glad they got all of those people involved. Lastly, I've got to say, I love the story of Edwin in the year 2000. He was standing directly behind Nelson Mandela, the one and only, at the first Laureus World Sport Gathering. That was the occasion when Mandela, standing right in front of Edwin, said, "Sport has the power to change the world. Sport can create hope where once there was only despair." I never tire of hearing that story. Mandela's words and Edwin's retelling of what an influence it had on his life. George, what did you think of, what did you take away from the conversation with Edwin?
Yeah, like you, Amby, so much. But we learned from Edwin that when he was growing up in Ohio, he was not particularly big or particularly fast, for that matter. And then, of course, came the growth spurt. And as he told us, I always lost until I won. And in the movie, Spike Lee called him Superman. That dominance, that stride, that preparation. And when the final loss came after a decade of winning, that incredible streak, it was actually food poisoning that brought him down. I mean, what a story, what a career.
Everybody loses eventually, as we all recognize, but you're right. It's interesting that his first loss after 122 wins wasn't quite an on-the-track loss. It was more a loss because of some bad food he had consumed and the weakness that followed that. So that's it for this week's episode of Running State of the Sport. We hope you enjoyed joining us as much as we enjoyed sharing the time with you. We'll be back again soon with another episode. Until then, please tell your friends about Running State of the Sport. We'd also appreciate a review at your favorite podcast host, like Apple Podcasts or Spotify Podcasts. And in signing off, here's our hope for the state of your own personal running. Chin up, clear eyes, full heart, keep moving, onward.